It's almost been 3 years since I did that Persona overview video, which introduced a lot of people to the early entries of that series. In this video, we're going to be doing the same thing with another one of my favourite video game franchises, Ace Combat. I'm going to be giving a brief rundown of every game in this series, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll understand why the upcoming Ace Combat 7 is such an important game, and why it's definitely worthy of your attention. First of all, let's go over what Ace Combat is and what it isn't. It is not a flight simulator, at least not in the stereotypical sense. There's no fiddling around in your cockpit with about 100 different knobs just for the sake of realism. Realism is definitely present in these games. They do feature a lot of real, licensed aircraft after all. But the fun aspect is what takes priority. At its core, Ace Combat is about being a badass ace pilot who can turn the tide of an entire war. Later on, it would come to be known more for its dramatic, anime-esque plots. Think more Metal Gear Solid, but with aircraft. A blend of real-world technology with sci-fi elements, such as giant super lasers and flying fortresses. It even has its own fictional setting called Strangereal, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's dive into the games one by one and give a brief overview. Treat this video as reference if you're considering jumping into the games but don't know where to start, or maybe just so you understand where the series came from in preparation for Skies Unknown. With that being said, it's worth mentioning its arcade origins with Namco's Air Combat and Air Combat 22. These can be considered the pilot games, if you'll forgive the pun, that would form the basis of the main series. The title for this one can be a little confusing because the US used the arcade title, Air Combat, while the Japanese release would have its own title, Ace Combat. Like the arcade games, it would be fast-paced and colourful, only with a more expanded single-player campaign. It had a non-linear mission structure, where the player had a choice of which mission they want to deploy on next. Not all missions had to be beaten to finish the game, and some missions become inaccessible depending on the order they're played in. You play as an unnamed ace pilot who is employed to quell a coup d'etat by a well-armed force of terrorists. You're given the option of flying the winged man that can provide support, for a price. You can hire a rookie on the cheap or spend a little more for an ace. Money earned at the end of missions can also be used to buy new aircraft. Keep in mind that these won't be replaced if you're shot down though, so try to keep that shiny new F-22 you just bought safe. There'll be a game over if you run out of planes, but fortunately this game did come with a save system, which wasn't a guarantee in early PS1 games. However, even around when this game was released, it wasn't graphically impressive. There's a lot of flat textures with little to no detail, and this can make trying to tell how close to the ground you are difficult. There's an altitude meter, but it's only visible in the first person view. The third person view is very limited in comparison. Ace Combat 2 was released 2 years later in 1997, and graphically, it's quite a jump in quality, and addresses many of the issues previously mentioned. The ideas behind the gameplay remain the same. You have to position yourself behind enemies and fire missiles when you have lock-on. The strategy behind firing at the right angle is probably the most essential skill in the entire series. The missile's homing capabilities will only help you so much. If the angle's too steep, it'll go right by and miss.
Jesus, miss!
These same rules apply to the enemy as well. So this creates an exciting game of risk versus reward. Do you continue on your current course and risk getting shot down, or do you brake the second the enemy fires on you? Speaking of enemies, they now have quite advanced AI with a difficulty curve. Early in the game, you'll be fighting against the rookies, but later you'll get more experienced aces. sometimes in experimental aircraft. The mission branching returns from the first game, and this time there's multiple endings, including an extended true ending with more missions. Ace Combat 2 would be the last game in the series to go for that light-hearted arcade feel. It's an excellent game that's hard not to love, if only for its rad 90s soundtrack. Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere is a fascinating game for many reasons. For international audiences, it was a pretty standard sequel with a bare-bones plot. But for the original Japanese market, it was an epic. It was spread across 2 discs and had 5 different routes to play through. The plot is no longer a black and white conflict involving terrorists. This time, the player takes the role of a pilot for a peacekeeping organisation in the year 2040, tasked with suppressing a war between 2 multinational corporations. At various points in the story, the player is given the choice of defecting to the other sides, including a transhumanist terrorist organisation called Ouroboros. Ouroboros seeks to upload all human consciousness to a network, known as the Electrosphere. Yeah, this one is basically Ace Combat meets Ghost in the Shell. The animation is even provided by the same studio, Production IG, so the influence is certainly being worn on its sleeve. However, as I mentioned earlier, what I'm describing is not in the international release of the game. All cutscenes were removed, all dialogue and story events within missions were stripped, and so were all of those branching pathways. The original 52 missions were cut down to a single 36 mission campaign. No anime waifus, just text on a boring black background. The gameplay is largely the same though. The physics and controls are easily the best of the PlayStation 1 era. This is also the first entry that would make the expert controls the default. The previous games had the simplified beginner controls as the default. The simplified controls would prevent the aircraft from rolling upside down for easier turning, while the advanced controls would allow you to perform more realistic aerial maneuvers. The latter is the best way of experiencing these games once you're confident enough, by the way. Electrosphere had many wonderful oddities that wouldn't reappear in future games, such as a space mission, but it also influenced the later games in significant ways. The sci-fi elements would be downplayed in later installments, but they still continue to pop up here and there. Also, there's an English fan translation of this. There's a link in the description for where you can find it.
I have so far to go.
Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies, also known as Ace Combat Distant Thunder in Europe, is the series' debut on the PlayStation 2. The story details a full-scale war between the continent of Usia and the Kingdom of Erusia. This isn't a terrorist plot or a war between corporations anymore. It's a World War II inspired conflict with far bigger stakes on the line. It's told within the framework of a man recounting his childhood, and through this we're told the story of Yellow 13, an Erusian fighter pilot who prides himself on always bringing back his allies alive. He holds a deep respect for rival ace pilot Mobius 1, the player character, and in turn, it's hard not to respect him back. It's difficult even calling Yellow 13 a villain because he really isn't. He just happens to be fighting on the opposite side. There's a deeply anti-war message here that gives it much more layers than any other game in its genre. It also has the best example of the series' core premise, being an unstoppable ace pilot who the enemy fears. Mobius 1 is perhaps the most beloved of the nameless protagonists. His development from an ace pilot to a battlefield legend is reflected in the radio chatter, which by this point had become an important storytelling device for the series.
Today's my birthday. A victory sure would be nice.
The gameplay itself is no slouch either. Missions are now more about gaining points within a certain time limit than simply destroying everything. These type of missions place more emphasis on your ammo supplies, which can be restocked by crossing the return line on one side of the map and then landing the plane at base. This would also be the first game to introduce secondary weapons, such as bombs and missiles with further range and quicker maneuvering. It adds a bit more variety to the gameplay, and makes you consider what you want to specialise in for that mission. Do you want to be an accurate ground bomber, a quick and agile dogfighter, or somewhere in between? At any rate, Ace Combat 4 might be one of the best games ever made. It's an amazing game that's a perfect blend of everything that came before it. Ace Combat 5: The Unsung War, or Ace Combat Squadron Leader in Europe, was released in 2004 for, once again, the PS2. It had big shoes to fill following the fourth game. It's debatable whether it's the better game or not, but either way, it's fantastic. This one opts for a more character-driven narrative as you take control of a squadron of 4. It follows another large-scale conflict, this time between the nation of Utobania and the Ocean Federation, which is not the same as Usia from the previous games. Actually, this is a good time to talk about continuity, as this would be the first game that would establish the entire Strangereal map. The first 2 games were retconned into this world, but they didn't really take place in it. The third game would establish Usia as the main continent on which most of these stories took place, and 4 would further build on this. However, the 5th game actually gave us a look at the larger world outside of Usia. The Unsung War took the radio chatter from Shattered Skies and built on it even further. Not only was it used for characterization and plot details, but it also created small side stories within missions, usually involving the ground units or civilians. It's all very cinematic. However, this cinematic approach to missions also made them a bit more linear. There's less of those missions from Shattered Skies where you were given more freedom. Ace Combat Advance was released in 2005 for the Game Boy Advance, and was the first handheld game in the series. This one isn't even worth talking about. It's a top-down shooter, and wasn't even developed by Namco. Visually, it's ugly, and it's hard to see what you're being shot at by. The most interesting thing about it is that it has ties to Electrosphere. So let's move swiftly on. Ace Combat 0: The Belkin War was released in 2006 on, once again, the PS2. It's a prequel that takes place during the Belkin War of 1995, which had a significant influence on the plot of the Unsung War. Its gameplay and missions was the perfect blend between the 2 previous games, and its story is a smaller, more personal one, very much in the same vein as Shattered Skies. It's told within the framework of a man making a documentary on the Belkin War, specifically the legendary ace pilot you play as. This framing device makes use of live-action actors to portray the various aces you fight throughout the game. We're not just seeing how the war affected them, we're seeing how it affected them 10 years after the fact, after they've had a chance to reflect on the past and grow from it. There's even something of an alignment system that determines what kind of ace you are: mercenary, soldier, or knight. A mercenary shows no mercy and finishes off even neutralized targets, while a knight allows him to escape and doesn't destroy defenseless targets. Soldier falls somewhere between the 2. This changes how the interviewees describe the player in the live-action cutscenes. Ace Combat 0 is a fantastic game on just about every level. It's another simple yet effective story, with some of the most satisfying gameplay the series has to offer. There's a rawness to the Belkin War that is unlike anything else in the series. You may not have an entire squadron this time around, but you do have one very reliable buddy.
Yo, buddy, you still alive?
Ace Combat X: Skies of Deception was released for the PSP in 2006. It was developed by Access Games rather than Namco's Project Aces team. But this is pretty much a PS2 Ace Combat game on the go. Skies of Deception follows a war between two neighbouring republics, chronicled by journalist Albert Jennett, who also appeared in the Unsung War. It has many of the same anti-war themes found in the previous games. The war in this one is ultimately pointless and fought for nothing more than the greed of some higher-ups. It's not a particularly amazing narrative, but it does enough to keep you invested. And the gameplay is just as solid as its PS2 counterparts. Ace Combat 6: Fires of Liberation was released in 2007 exclusively for the Xbox 360. While it's not a bad game by any means, it is generally considered lower quality than its predecessors. It's about the country of Emeria following an invasion by a military-controlled neighbouring country, called Slovakia. Their initial attack drives the people of Emeria from their homeland, and most of the campaign centres on Garuda team as they try to take it back. There's a lot of focus on bringing the country of Emeria to life by showing its culture, landmarks and people. Similar to past games, the player character is not really the focus of the plot. It follows a mother trying to reunite with her daughter across a war-torn land, and an Slovakian intelligence officer during his army's occupation of Emeria. The latter helps to bring some humanity to the enemy country, but it's nothing that hasn't already been done better in past games. This game had a lot to live up to, and while it clearly tried to take a different approach to telling its story, it ended up being a less compelling one overall, mainly because of the weaker writing and characters. It doesn't work as a small, personal story like Shattered Skies and Zero did, and it doesn't really match the scale of the Unsung War either. Its gameplay, on the other hand, is slightly more impressive. This was the next generation of Ace Combat after all, and it attempts to create battlefields on a larger scale. Missions are longer and made up of multiple objectives, a certain amount of which must be accomplished if the mission is to succeed. You can tackle these objectives in whatever order you please, and all are taking place simultaneously. There's also a new mechanic where you can order allied support to either cover you or take out a group of targets. It's different from the regular squad commands as it's much more effective, but you also have to charge up a meter before you can use it. It's a spectacle worth checking out. Unfortunately, it didn't sell very well, forcing Namco, who had now become Bandai-Namco by the way, to go back to the drawing board for the next big installment. But before we get to that, we have some other smaller titles to take a look at. Ace Combat XI: Skies of Incursion is an iOS exclusive released in 2009, and acts as a prequel to Ace Combat X. It follows Falco Squadron of the Aurelian Air Force, instead of Griffith Squadron from X. Unfortunately, since the release of iOS 9, this is no longer playable, nor is it being sold on the Apple Store anymore. Ace Combat Joint Assault is yet another installment on the PSP. However, unlike its predecessor, it doesn't take place in the Strangereal world. It's a little weird. It may take place in the real world, but it still has the series' trademark flying superweapons. It's incredibly easy to shoot down enemy units in this game because of the less intelligent AI. Most of the enemies don't even take evasive action. The story is about a terrorist organisation called the Valahia, funded by an insurance company for world domination or something. Yeah, you shouldn't really play this one for its story. Ace Combat Assault Horizon was released in 2011, and is probably the most controversial game in the entire series. Like Joint Assault, it would take place in the real world, perhaps in an attempt to reinvent the series for a new audience. But it also did a lot of other things as well, many of which were clearly inspired by what other AAA action titles were doing at the time, such as turret sections, an airstrike mission, regenerating health, much more muted colours, and a Tom Clancy-esque storyline. However, what's generally cited as its worst creative decision is dogfight mode. Instead of the usual method of dispatching enemies, in this one you mainly had to lock onto them with dogfight mode. This allowed you to get up close and personal with other aircraft, and placed greater emphasis on your machine guns. But it also took a lot of control from the player. The plane is on autopilot, and you don't need to do much to score a kill. Enemies could also engage the player in dogfight mode, a situation that is almost always resolved with a counter. The game was well received by critics, but mostly hated by fans for relying on style over substance. The storyline presented here is distinctly not Ace Combat. The only core idea of the series being retained is its focus on being an unstoppable ace pilot. Everything else, such as its characters, lack what made the series so compelling in the PS2 era. The soul that shot it into popularity had been lost, and replaced with something they thought would appeal to a wider audience. There was also a mobile game based on Assault Horizon, titled Triggerfinger. Ace Combat Assault Horizon Legacy was released on the 3DS the same year as Assault Horizon. It has a deceptive title, because the two games have little to do with each other. They don't even take place in the same universe. Legacy is back in Strangereal, and is a remake of Ace Combat 2. The original Japanese title was actually Ace Combat 3D Cross Rumble. It greatly expands on Ace Combat 2's storyline, and makes it fit better with the Strangereal continuity. So does this remake do Ace Combat 2 justice? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't quite reach those heights. This one doesn't have dogfight mode, but it has its own set of new mechanics. You're able to quickly get behind enemies when you see a yellow arrow appear, and you dodge incoming missiles by holding a direction on screen and the Y button. This turns evading enemy fire into more of a quick-time event than a game of risk versus reward. The physics are also a little weird if you're used to past entries. Nevertheless, the return to Strangereal is a welcome one. Ace Combat Northern Wings is a Java mobile game released in 2011. It's another top-down shooter Strangereal title, and takes place during a lot of different games. It's considered an even bigger joke than Ace Combat Advance, so there's not really much to say.
Every day I wake up unsure.
Ace Combat Infinity was released in 2014 under a free-to-play model. It was basically Ace Combat The Greatest Hits, recreating many of the memorable missions from past Strangereal games. Only it didn't take place in Strangereal. It was set in the real world, again. Or rather, a version of the real world that shares many of the same events as Strangereal. You can probably tell that by this point the series had become more about reminiscing of its glory days. It also seemed like it wanted its cake and eat it too, by trying to appeal to new players with the new setting, but also old school fans. Infinity's gameplay was well liked, but its free-to-play model was heavily criticised. To play missions, you had to either buy fuel credits with real money, or wait for them to be unlocked after a set period of time. There's really no reason for me to talk about this game because it's no longer possible to play. Since March of 2018, all of the game's services have been shut down. This would have been a sad note to end on. What started as a great franchise had fallen so far. It was no longer selling well, and its fans were feeling betrayed after Assault Horizon, and the weird business decisions involved with Infinity. Fortunately, this isn't the end. Whatever the future of the series may be, we at least know there will be one final hurrah. Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown releases in January 2019. It's a return to the Strangereal world after many attempts to get away from it. Could this be a return to the brilliance of that PlayStation 2 era? Only time will tell, but its trailers certainly promise that. I'm sure I'll get around to posting a review of it at some point on this channel, so stick around. Until then, keep flying, and I'll see you in the skies.
On which